There's a specific kind of person who remembers rewinding a VHS tape before returning it to Blockbuster, and also remembers the exact week they downloaded their first MP3. Not someone who only knows streaming, not someone who never touched a cassette. Someone who lived through both back-to-back right in the middle of figuring out who they were. If that's you, this video was made for you specifically. Most generational research works in broad windows: boomers, Gen X, millennials, Gen Z. But there's a group that sits in the gap, too young to be fully Gen X, too old to be a true millennial, and for decades, psychologists genuinely didn't know what to do with them. That confusion, it turns out, is very revealing, because the people it describes didn't just experience two eras, they were shaped by the exact seam between them. In 2014, sociologist Sarah Stankorb gave this group a name for the first time: Zillennials, a microgeneration born between roughly 1977 and 1985, sitting in the narrow gap between Gen X and millennials. Some researchers call them the Oregon Trail generation, after the old computer game many of them played in school, always navigating uncertain terrain with limited supplies, figuring out the next move as they went. It's a more accurate description than it sounds, because what happened inside that specific window of time left a psychological mark that broader categories simply can't explain. Think about what life was really like before the internet. You'd write notes on folded pieces of paper in class and pass them to each other. You'd make plans to meet at a certain time in a certain spot, go there, and wait. There was no way to check if the other person was running late. Either they'd show up or they wouldn't. And people remembered what kind of person you were. If you missed a TV show, it was gone. You'd ask a friend to describe it and spend the rest of the week imagining it. What about your mistakes? That fight at the party? That embarrassing thing you said in front of the wrong person? That period in 9th grade? Everything was forgotten. No one archived it. No one took a screenshot. It lived on in a few people's memories and slowly transformed into something softer, just as memories do when there's nothing to keep them alive. Growing up in a world that allowed for forgetting meant your past could become a story, not a permanent file you were forced to live with forever. Just as I was approaching the end of my teenage years and the beginning of my 20s, the whole world suddenly changed. Not gradually, almost overnight. Email, cell phones, faster internet, MySpace, broadband. Within a few years, the world I grew up in seemed to vanish, and a completely different world emerged in its place. A study published in the journal Nature Neuroscience revealed that the part of the brain responsible for learning new systems continues to develop until the age of 25. You found yourself right in the middle of the digital revolution during this time. You were old enough to clearly remember what came before. You were young enough that your brain was still truly open to what was taking its place. Generation X had to learn the internet much like an adult learning a second language. The younger Millennial and Generation Z cohorts, however, grew up immersed in the internet. For them, the internet isn't a tool they had to learn. For them, the internet is the water they swim in. You are the only group that experienced both, and that door remained open for just a few years. Then it closed. Here's a point worth pausing to consider. Because not all of these are sources of power, and almost no one talks about the parts that aren't. Generally, you end up serving as a natural mediator in any setting, between older colleagues who value process and hierarchy, and younger colleagues who value speed and autonomy. This position seems like an advantage, and it usually is. But being the one who fills every gap, constantly absorbing the friction between the two sides, to keep things running, means getting things back on track without anyone asking you what the cost is. Psychologists call this emotional labor. And people who make a habit of it begin to lose awareness of what they're doing. If you've spent years living as the reliable one and feel a sense of exhaustion whose exact source you can't pinpoint, this isn't a personality trait. It's the cost of holding things together for a long time without letting go. But there's another layer. One that lives quieter in small decisions most people never trace back to its source. You entered the job market around the dot-com bust in the early 2000s. First real jobs, first apartments, first real attempt at building a life. And the floor dropped almost immediately. You rebuilt slowly, carefully. And just as you were reaching your most stable years, 2008 happened. Economists call this a scarring effect. Financial instability in your early career leaves a mark that doesn't disappear when things improve. You can see it in the emergency fund that never feels large enough. The backup plan built even when there's no obvious reason to need one. The slight hesitation before committing to something permanent, even when everything looks fine. That's not anxiety. It's closer to muscle memory. Your body remembering something your mind has already moved past. If you've noticed that pattern in yourself and never knew where it came from, now you do. Here's what most people overlook about this microgeneration. What kind of generation is it? Extremely cautious, always a peacemaker, adaptable, quietly resilient, hard to categorize. So, what is it really? Financially scarred by history, carrying emotional labor invisibly, neurologically shaped by two worlds, practiced at landing when the ground moves, living proof that identity survives disruption. The person who rewound that VHS tape and then figured out MP3s a few years later didn't do that because they were especially adaptable. They did it because they had no other choice. The world changed. And they changed with it without drama, without losing the version of themselves that existed before. That's quieter than it sounds, and rarer than most people realize. You watched the end of a world. Not with an announcement, not with a clear before and after, just slowly, and then suddenly, just as things change when you least expect them to. And then you watched the beginning of another event. You were mature enough to understand what was left behind, yet young enough to move on to the next one without getting stuck at the edge. Most people have just one world. You, however, caught the point of convergence, that exact moment when one version of human life transforms into a completely different one. And you learned not as a lesson, but simply by living that who you are doesn't have to be defined by the world you started in. While the ground is constantly shifting for everyone, those who've learned to stand on their own 2 feet without forgetting where they came from, carry something that can't be taught, something that can only be learned by living. Before I go, I want to ask you something. What's the one thing you truly miss from the pre-internet world? Write it in the comments. I read every single one, and the answers always reveal surprisingly deep insights into who people really are. And if, while reading this, someone comes to mind, someone who quietly and incredibly adapts without ever receiving the recognition they deserve, send this to them. Recognition is a rare gift. This channel exists to name the things that shaped you before you could even give them a name. Those patterns, the silent traces left by history, your strengths that no one ever thought to celebrate. If this matters to you, subscribe, not for the algorithm's sake, but for that version of yourself who is still trying to make sense of the world. You didn't just survive 2 worlds. You learned to carry both without dropping either one. That's not nothing. That's everything.